Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for week 4 of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group's 2025 Analytics Series. A warm welcome to all of those joining us by conference call. We're all glad to have you here. So, our first presenter this afternoon is going to be William McIntyre, joining us from Howard University. Tonight, he'll be presenting on correlation versus causation. William, whenever you're ready, feel free to share your screen.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is William McIntyre, and today I'll be talking about correlation versus causation. So first, what is correlation? Correlation is a statistical measure, usually expressed as a number that describes the size and direction of a relationship between two variables. And this could be used to look into different studies across different departments in as far as healthcare and as far as just other particular stores as well. And this is a statistical relationship between two variables, and then when one changes, the other changes as well. And we'll look into variables a little later in the presentation. Now, correlation between variables, however, does not automatically mean that the change in one variable in the cause of the change in the values of the other variable. So this means that correlation does not always equal causation. And now what is causation? Causation is the measure of two variables that move together, and they both have direction in the closeness of their movements. And one variable directly affects or causes another one to change. And causation indicates that one event is the result of the occurrence of the other event. So that means that since one happens, this will cause the other one to happen. This is an example of cause and effect. So here's an example of causation. So as you can see, the germs both cause bad smells and diseases. And this correlates because both the bad smells and diseases are caused by the germs. So the bad smells and diseases will be the correlation, while the germs and the bad smells will be a causation, and the germs and the disease would be a causation. So different types of variables. So first is independent variable. This is the variable that you often change or manipulate in the experiment. This is often known as the purpose or the reason for the actual experiment to be done. And so, example, if you're testing how sunlight affects plant growth, you'll look into like the amount of sunlight as an independent variable that affects the plant growth. And that'll be a dependent variable. And this is the variable that you measure or observe. It depends on the change you make to the independent variable. And so, like I said before, this would be like the plant growth, for example, and the independent variable will be the sunlight. And so the control variables are variables that do not change throughout the experiment. So like for example, like the plant type will be not changed, will be the same for all the experiments, also the same amount of water. This is so you have controlled results throughout your presentation and throughout your experiment. So the confounding variables or extraneous variables. These are variables that unintentionally affect the dependent variable, making it harder for the results to get interpreted. So like for example, if one plant gets more wind exposure than the other, this might affect the plant growth and even sunlight if that's a variable that you're testing. And also different types of data. So two main types are quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative relates to numbers. So for example, that could be like the height, weight, age, or like before, to use the previous example, like the height of the plants. While qualitative might be like the hair color, brand of shoes, or the type of treatment. So roles. So in this table, this shows the different types of variables and how it relates to correlation and causation. So for example, for independent variables, the role of causation is it must be tested to see if there's a causes change. Whereas in correlation, it may or may not be part of the correlation. And while for the dependent variable, it may correlate to others, while in the causation is measured to see if it changes as a result of the correlation. And for the confounded variable, it may create false correlations, while in the causation, it must be controlled to prove real causation. And as far as for the last one, control variable, it usually is ignored in correlation, while as in causation, it usually is kept constant to isolate cause and effect. This is a graph that shows a positive correlation. I'm not sorry, this is a scatter plot that shows the positive correlation and negative correlation. Here in the positive correlation, you can see on the X value is the number of minutes of exercise daily, and the Y value has the heart health. As you can see, there is a standard increase in heart health and also the number of minutes exercise daily. This is why it's a positive correlation because the graph seems to increase. And where as far as the negative correlation, you can see on the X value is the number of cigarettes smoked, and then the lung health is the Y value. As you can see, the data shows that it's a slight decrease, and also like this is a negative study. So as you can see, it is a negative correlation since the values keep decreasing as the Y value continues, as the X value continues. So correlation versus causation. So like I said before, causation means that when you change one variable, and that's usually like the explanatory variable, it directly causes a change in a different variable. In other words, one thing is actually making the other thing happen. So like I said before, it's like cause and effect situation. Correlation, on the other hand, that just means that that two things are related, so they move together in some way. But just because they're linked doesn't mean that one causes one another. So to put it simply, there's only one correlation changing one variable, and that won't necessarily change the other. So there's no guaranteed cause-effect relationship as far as correlation. And acting on correlation as if causation can be dangerous. So, for example, you could say that if kids who wear glasses do better in school, that doesn't mean they actually do good grades. That just means they read more. That's not true. So, correlation coefficient. In this graph, this shows the correlation coefficient, which is represented by the letter R. And as you can see in this chart, or this scatter plot right here, it is a straight line, and that shows the linear relationship between it. As you see for this one is 0.85 correlation coefficient. And as you can see, the dotted data points are a little bit scattered off as far as like a scatter plot, for example. And so as you can see, as the correlation coefficient equals 1, this is a strong relationship. Whereas the R equals 0.85, that means the relationship isn't as strong. And that's because the correlation becomes weaker as the correlation coefficient becomes farther apart. So like I said before, once correlation reaches 0, there'll be no linear relationship. And it'll be just scatter plots as like the previous slide. This is another correlation example. In this study found like the infant mortality rates of live births. So as you can see, the correlation describes the strength and direction of relationship between two variables. In this case, there's a strong negative relationship as time increases from infant mortality rate tends to decrease. As you can see, this is the correlation and its linear relationship, it decreases. So the phrase strong negative linear relationship association explicitly states this. So as you can see, there's a negative relationship between the values, between the x and y coordinates. And the data points show that it's a consistent decrease in the relationship. This is another causation example. So as you can see, the causation is when A directly affects B. So as you can see, when the phone runs out of battery, it directly affects the phone shutting down, which is the cause of it. And the phone run out of battery means the phone will also won't work. So the camera will work because the phone shut off. It's the correlation. So to conclude, understanding the difference between correlation and causation is essential for making smart, evidence-based, real-world decisions. While correlation helps us identify patterns and generate hypotheses, causation goes a step further by showing direct links that may lead to effective actions or interventions. Whether in healthcare, technology, education, or daily life, being able to distinguish between the two prevents misinformation that helps us to find real world solutions. So since we're all hopefully going into medicine, we should all look into how we cannot let correlation and causation confuse us, especially this happens oftentimes in a lot of healthcare situations. This is a key skill to develop to become a critical thinker and a responsible decision maker. These are references.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. I'd like to open up for any questions or thoughts, or Dr. Lopez, if you had anything you wanted to add.
Thank you, William, for your presentation. I wanted to add or comment. I liked the visual that you gave for the correlation versus causation, and I think it was really helpful in distinguishing between the two.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think just another note to add, you talk about confounding variables, especially when we're making like research plans or trying to go through literature. Much of our limitations happen when we don't account for these confounding variables that could impact the results that we get. So just as we move forward, looking at confounding variables, it was a good point to add.
Thank you.
Yes, I think the importance here is when we're making these assumptions, that we need to clearly define, is it a causation or a correlation? Hypothetically, are more players being injured in their head and face, maybe because of the correlation of the low tackling rules or laws that have been employed? We can't make that assumption or jump to it being a causation until we have the data to support that. We can allude to the fact that it could be a correlation. And Willie, why don't you maybe see if you, by using that example, why don't you try to highlight that to the team?
Yeah. So like, wait, you're talking about my example in the presentation?
No, son. Basically, if we're going to look at data, or let me say, we know that we have a large head and neck, maybe head and face injury rate.
Yes.
We can't make the causation yet that it's due to the fact of the lower tackling height employed by the rules or laws of the governance, right?
Yes.
But we can make a correlation that it could possibly be due to the tackling at a lower body part.
Yes,
Until we have more data, we can't really support the causation, but we can make a correlation.
Yes,
Do you
once we get
understand
more
what I
data,
mean?
once we get more data, we could see like the causation between the two, since we only know the correlation between the two. Yes.
Does everyone understand what we're alluding to here? Yeah. So we can make a correlation because we can assume that because of the law changes, or maybe players just inappropriately tackling, they may be tackling low and then getting a knee to the face or getting a knee, to the head. That's where we're getting concussions, or maybe we're getting lacerations to the face, or even impacts to the mouth and teeth. But we can't make a full-on causation due to the fact that lowered tackle rates, because that's only been in law for like the past couple of years, a year and a half, maybe 2 years. You get what I mean? So we can't make that causation, but we can make a correlation on that. Statistically, we can support it in a correlation, but we can't do it by causation because we don't have enough data to support that within the window of the new law changes. So I'm sorry. Does everyone understand what I'm trying to say here? Right? Because you don't have enough data to support the causation. You can make a correlation, and that limits you on what you're supporting in the data. Okay, everyone? So that's all it is. I think there's an understanding that needs to be done between the correlation and causation as well. Okay, thank you.
Our second intern is Lawrence Kanger from Alabama College of Osteopathic Medicine. Lawrence will be presenting on basics of randomization in clinical trials. Lawrence, may you please share your screen?
So I'll be presenting on the basics of randomization in clinical trials. My name is Larry Kangro. I'm going into my second year at the Alabama College of Osteopathic Medicine. So just a little intro. Randomization is crucial for high quality clinical research. It ensures unbiased group assignment. It allows for valid comparisons and evidence-based practices. And it's especially important in athletic training and health research. There's a lot of evidence-based tests and trials out there that we use in practice right now. So it's so crucial that we maintain an unbiased type of research. So why do we randomize? Again, prevent selection bias and prevent our systematic differences between groups. Ensures allocation concealment. So when investigators or researchers are distributing out, say a medication to a test subject in a control group, they don't know who's getting what. And overall, this will strengthen statistical validity of the results. So the four major randomization techniques are simple, block, stratified, and covariate adaptive. On the right, we see a little graph showing kind of the way we break it all down, and we're going to go into a little more details of each. So simple, each participant is going to have an equal chance to go in either group. So this is good in large trials, but will cause more issues in smaller sample groups because it can lead to uneven groups. So say you have 10 people, 7 people can be in the control group and 3 in the treatment group, which could lead to some skewing of the data and some unevenness there. Body block randomization. So this will ensure that group sizes are equal. So you can use it for smaller samples. You're going to break down the larger sample into smaller groups, into little blocks, and then you're going to separate from there. And there's a bunch of different combinations you can have. It allows for a balanced sample size, like I mentioned, but it may not control for covariates like age or other comorbidities. It's kind of just randomly separating the groups. Stratified, so this is dividing based on those covariates, sex, age, BMI, and this allows randomization within each group. So to control those confounding variables, but it can be complex when you have a lot of the different covariates, and it requires all the participants to be identified before group assignment. And then we have covariate adaptive. So this is assigning participants based on, the previous assignments or the ones already set, and then the covariates they have. So it'll use different methods like the Taves, the Pocock and Simon, or the Frame. And this is good for data where you're having ongoing enrollment and many different covariates, but it can be very complex or even predictable. So looking at each technique, so the Taves, this is good for simple situations and limited covariates. You're going to assign the individual to the group with the lowest total covariate values. So you're going to compare all the groups, look at the covariates, see how many people are in what range, and see who needs a little more differentiation. The next one, you're going to test, both groups, and you're going to see which has the lowest sum of the differences of people, and that's how you're going to match into each group. So this is good for medium complexity studies. And then you're going to have the Frame method, which is going to look at the p-values and see any statistical imbalance and match people in trying to minimize that statistical imbalance. And this is good for advanced trials or when variables aren't all categories. So choosing method, larger trials, you're going to want to go with simple. A smaller trial, you can go with block or stratified. If you need to balance covariates, you can use stratified or adaptive. And then if you're having that continuous enrollment, covariate adaptive is probably your best bet. In conclusion, randomization improves validity. The method you choose has to match the trial size, the structure, and the goals of the experiment. And then there's covariate adaptive specifically provides optimal balance, especially with complex covariates. And a quality randomization equals better evidence and base practice. Thank you.
Thank you for that great presentation. Are there any questions from the group, or Dr. Lopez, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Larry did a great job covering all the points. It's always difficult, when you find out these variables. You often, even times, find these variables after you've done these analyses. You're like, oh, wait, there's even another variable we should consider. I think when you try to preemptively prepare, and that's why we do these detailed Excel sheets. Why? If you take into consideration all the variables, when you try to create a model to analyze something, you can then include or exclude different variables from that data set to provide you the results you're looking for. When you have a large choice of variables, it allows you to show what kind of analytics you can do or sub-analytics within that data set. Obviously, depending on the large or the size of the variables, then you can really, because of the size of the variables, you can then make sure that you have statistical findings that are significant for that variable or that analyses between variables. And again, we'll go over this a little bit over, maybe like week 7, 8. We'll go over an example of how we pulled variables to create models. And you can see how all this that you're learning right now will build upon when we show you the models that we've created. And I think as you see each day, you're learning another fact or another aspect that just adds to you. So when we're speaking, you're understanding more when we're talking about the literature or we're talking about the analyses. And again, that's all I could suggest is just keep reading. So this way you can learn as much as you can. But otherwise, good job there, Larry.
If there are no more questions, I'm going to move on to our final presentation. For our final presentation, we have Violet, who's joining us from Ithaca College. Her presentation is on types of variables in research. Whenever you're ready, Violet, feel free to share your screen.
So as Minna mentioned, I will be talking about the types of variables in research. And as Dr. Lopez just briefly explained as well about variables, I'm going to just get into the nitty-gritty of it. So in statistics, it's all about collecting data, recording variables, and then using that data to make a generalization about a population based on the multiple research articles that we've already begun reading. You can see how they talk about the statistics, how they're making generalizations about a specific population in rugby and in different sports. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that. So to start off, what is a variable? It's a recorded piece of information or characteristic about a person, a case, or a unit within a study. It can vary or change from person to person. An example of this would be age. So the age is the variable that would be recorded. However, it changes from person to person, especially when a study is based on a specific group or population of people. Sometimes they'll focus on an age range from 18 to 20, or they'll discuss young adults, which would be children or anyone in the population below teenagers. It just will depend on what the study is focusing on. So it's very mindful to be aware of what exactly the study is focusing on. This would be the opposite of a constant variable because it remains the same throughout the entire study, so nothing is changing. Other examples would include weight, illness, or biological sex. Different types of variables are categorical ones, which describe a unit or a person that can be placed in a specific category. This can be where they were born, their hair color, their gender, or their educational level. Another word for categorical would be qualitative, which just then again places people into categories or records qualities about them. Another type of variable would be numeric, which is recorded numerical quantities like age, weight, temperature, or time. Then again, it records quantities. As for categorical variables, they're subdivided into two categories. which are nominal and ordinal. Nominal, there is no ordering based on magnitude or size. So a characteristics of this would be there is no natural order, which means that no category is greater than the other. Categories are exhaustive, so therefore all possibilities are listed. This can be an example of different basketball teams. There's a wide variety of them, and all of them are included. There's no declusivity of that. They are also possibly to be numerically coded, like the Likert scale, which I'll explain later in the presentation. It is noted that you can also organize this data alphabetically. It's not really considered as basing it on magnitude or size. Then you have ordinal categorical variables, which means that there is a rank or ordering to the categories. And in this one, the characteristics of it would be clear ranking, which you would understand that there is a different range based on size. They're useful for expressing preference, severity, or agreement, which is also talked about in the research articles that we are reading. So it's good to be mindful of that. And they are also coded numerically. An example of this would be 1 is the best or 5 worst based on a pain scale. If you're asking an athlete how are they feeling after just getting an injury or recovering from an injury, it's just important to be mindful of how we can use these skills in our research as well as in our professional areas. So another example of ordinal category variables would be when someone orders a coffee, they're getting a small, medium, or large, and this that small is smaller than a medium and a medium is smaller than a large. Or when you're buying clothes, you have sizes from 0 to 8, sometimes 10, 12, depending on where you're shopping. As for numeric variables, we have them subdivided into discrete or continuous. So discrete is that they only take integers, which is 0, 1, 2, 3. Therefore, the values are distinct and separate, so there are no fractions or decimals that are being used. Often they represent counts. For an example would be the number of people or goals made in a game, and they can be both finite, which is limited, or infinite, which is from 0 to infinity, just no in-between numbers. Another example would be like the amount of people in an emergency room. That would either be 20 or it can range, or it can be 100. You can take this data based on how many come in throughout an hour, how many come in throughout a day, through a week. It just depends on the research. For continuous, they are measured on a continuous scale. So the values exist on a continuum. They represent measurements, and they can take infinitely many values with range. So an example of this would be when recording someone's weight, they're rounded to the nearest pound of a kilogram, which therefore they are measured on the continuous scale because someone can be 142.5 pounds or 64.5 kilograms. So here we have some examples. Hair color would be represented as a categorical nominal because it is a category, but there's no ordering. You can order it based on alphabetically ordered, but then again, there's no numerical order, so therefore it's not ordinal. Income would be described as numerical continuous because someone can get paid $500.50 a week. Number of people in an emergency room, as described before, that would be numerical discrete because there's only integers. You can't have half of a person. As for temperature, that would be numerical continuous. Coffee would be categorical ordinal because, like I said before, small, medium, or large. Age would be numerical continuous, as well as weight. Country of birth would be categorical nominal. Disease would also be categorical nominal, and so would biological size. So here is the picture and the example of a Likert scales. Note that some categorical variables will be recorded with numbers, but they don't necessarily represent numerical values. It's more of just a scale, just to give people who, you'll likely see this in surveys, will rate 1 to 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. How do you think? But then they'll describe, here you can see it says satisfaction, quality, frequency, performance, importance. They're more just labeled. The numbers are more used as labels for the data, but there's no value that the numbers have here. You can also convert a numerical value into a categorical one. Like for example, when you go to the movies, they'll have tickets for children, adults, or seniors, and then they'll range the prices differently based on the category that the person fits into. Both categorical and numeric variables are both often treated similarly in analysis because they are both quantitative, but it's also important to remember the distinction between the two. For example, you can ask, how long does it take a certain specific population to run a mile? That would be numeric continuous. Whereas making it competitive by listing the order of who comes first, second, or third, that would then make it categorical ordinal. So it's very important to make sure that you're understanding what the study is focusing on and how they're collecting that data, because it can get very confusing. So just some key points here. Categorical variables are often summarized using proportions or percentages. For example, looking at biological sex, we would summarize the data as how many males and how many females were there. Or we can do what the percentage of male compared to females was. Numeric variables are often summarized based on the mean or median of a data set. Discrete or continuous variables can further be subdivided into scales of measurement. This would be examples of the ratio scale or the interval scale. The ratio scale has a meaningful 0 or a meaningful ratio, which represents the complete absence of a variable. So for an example, when looking at age or weight, an age or weight of 0 means that there is no variable, no value there. So when we think meaningful, we think that someone who is 20 is twice the age of someone who's 10, or someone who's 30 is double the age of someone that's 15. This is what meaningful means, is what you can take meaning out of the data. Whereas the interval scale, we have a non-meaningful 0. So for example, when looking at 0 degrees Celsius, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an absence of the temperature. Therefore, 20 degrees does not mean that it's twice as hot as 10 degrees, if that makes sense. And lastly, identifiers are used to identify an individual, but are not represented as a true variable. And these are my references.
Thank you for that presentation. I'd also like to open up for any questions or comments, or Dr. Lopez, if you have anything you'd like to add.
So as I was saying, the importance here is obviously, thank you, Violet. That was a great job of describing the details of the various variables and where they come from. I think what happens, it comes down to is that not only are the variables and the details of the variables important, but as Lawrence was alluding to, the randomization of the variables. So once we knew we had to go nationally to randomize our data set than just from the Northeast, you knew that we had to get a larger data set from a larger cohort, coming from multiple players of various backgrounds. So randomizing the data really validates our data set in such a way that I know you guys probably not think of it, but it was a lot of forethought. I was very, very lucky to have the teachers to envision just launching this, let alone for them to support me or to believe in what I was going to do. So when you make sure you think about all that, when you put those together, the randomization of the data now is just our injury data is just phenomenal. And let alone also making sure that we go to the large scale events for any surveys, right? We're not just going to the Northeast, we're going to the championships, or we're going to Las Vegas Invitational, previously the Las Vegas Invitational, and now the New York Sevens Invitational. These have players coming in from multiple locations. So Larry, they validate the randomization of the data. They support the multiple variables in the data, and therefore when we analyze it, it should have been in this order. Then Willie, we can start looking at the correlations, right? To really find the causations within the data set. And that was done with our, we'll discuss that later when we're off the call. But the importance is you can see how each one of these build up on why our data sets are very, very well done. Like I said, only 5 weeks later, you guys really have an idea of what we're doing with it. Prior to this, you probably didn't understand, but now when you see it, you can definitely understand. If Philip reaches out to an analytical company, or whether he's presenting at the American College of Sports Medicine, he has the knowledge base that he knows our data set. And guess what? They also know now that we know what we're sitting on. And when we ask for data, it's to support the large data set we have already. If he's asking a company or if he's presenting, he knows that our data set is valid in that aspect because it has randomization. The variables are all there for anyone to analyze, right? We're making sure that we allude to the correlations, but not jump to causation without assumption, by assumptions. We need to make sure we're not jumping there without validating the data. So everyone, I tried to put the three talks together so you understand where we're going with it and why we do it the way we do. I hope you all understand that now. Okay? All right. Yeah, strong work, everyone. Good. Any other questions, please? Otherwise, you did a great job.
If there are no more questions, that brings us to the end of today's session. On behalf of the entire Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group, thank you all for being here with us. We appreciate your time and engagement in the analytics series, and we look forward to seeing you next time.